Hello, welcome to White Davy Gardening and Worm Farm. In today's discussion, we're going to be discussing some of the things that I have learned in the 5 years that I have been worm farming. And of course, if you have anything that you would like to share regarding what you have learned from your worm farming, then that would be great also. Yeah. First, I must apologize for being late. Oh, hi, Han White. I had a visitor just before my discussion starts, so that is why I'm late. So, my apologies for that. Yeah, so it's been 5 years since I started worm farming. When I started worm farming, my goal was just a faster way to compost the food scraps so that I can have it to use in my garden. Oh, hi, Mom. So that was the reason why I started worm farming, just to produce the compost faster, because in my cold region, it usually takes a full year for me to have finished compost. But then I am pretty thankful that I learned about worm farming because there is so much to learn. I didn't even know that there was such a thing as worm farming, let alone the many benefits that comes from worm farming. So I've learned a lot of things both from doing research and from doing my own experiments. So today I'm going to be sharing some of the things that I have learned from experiments. And we're going to be discussing some of the things that when you research the information that you get and what you actually observe when you're worm farming differs. It does not necessarily mean that the information is wrong, it's just a different perspective. So I like to do my experiments because then I get so how I care for my worms in fall 2019 to February 2021. So between that time, fall 2019 to February 2021, I have been feeding my worms finished compost. Now, what I find when I feed my worms finished compost is that they eat slower and they produce less worms. Now, I've used compost in different ways and get different results. But when I use compost as both the bedding for the worms and the food source for the worms with nothing else added, apart from maybe roughage and stuff like that, then they eat slower and they reproduce slower. Now, one thing that I've learned about using this method where the only thing in the bin is finished compost for bedding and food is that the material tend to dry out faster, and so it requires more water to maintain the bin than if I was using food scraps. Another thing that I observe is that, excuse me, excuse me, when I use just the compost with no other form of bedding, the material tend to become compact. But using just compost in your worm bin does have its advantages. For example, when I was using just compost to feed my worms, I noticed that I didn't have an issue with rodents and fruit flies and things like those entering the bin. Another advantage is that it takes less time to maintain the bin because when I'm feeding just compost, I would fill the entire bin with compost. And then the only thing that I would have to do to maintain those bins was I had to water the bin and I had to aerate the bin from time to time because, as I mentioned, the material will compact. So, pretty much that's all I had to do when I maintain the bin when it is fed just finished compost. And that is one of the things that I found really attractive about using the compost because I'm always busy and finding the time to maintain all of my bins can be a real challenge. And so using the compost does work pretty well for me. It's just that the rate at which the worms reproduce is not necessarily ideal for what I want. Now, using the compost is very good if you're going on vacation because then you can have a longer vacation as long as you ensure that you have sufficient moisture in the worm bin. So, what I would do if I'm going on vacation is I would make sure that I give the bin a little bit more water than I normally would. One of the reasons, though, why my worm bin, when I feed them just compost, tend to reproduce slower is because I tend to keep it more on the drier side than on the wetter side. So just enough moisture to keep the bin, to keep the compost moist. Yes, so I tend to keep it more on the drier side because in one of the experiments that I did, oh, hi, Leafy Wiggy. One of the experiments that I did with compost, I had one bin that I would keep it more on the drier side. It has enough moisture to keep the worms going, but just enough. And then another bin that I had compost in that I kept moist at the right moisture content. That one that was at the right moisture content produced more worms, and the worms consumed the material faster than the one that was kept a bit drier than the required moisture content. So because I was keeping the bin below that level, then it did not reproduce as much. And I'm going to be discussing a little bit more on this as we go down into the discussion. Okay, and White is saying hi to Leafy Wiggy. Yes. No, because the compost does not attract pests, it makes it a little cheaper to have your worm bin because, for one thing, when I use food scraps, I have to contemplate making sure that the bin has cover. I have to spend more time burying the food scraps in the bedding. I have to create netting to cover the bin so that even when I remove the cover, bin flies and other pests can't get in. So it is a bit more expensive to operate the bin when you're feeding food scraps, but that also depends on whether or not you are the one producing the food scraps or if you're the one producing the compost that you're using, because if you have to buy the compost, then it's going to be more expensive. Oh, hi, Peggy. I'm doing okay. Yes, I'm doing okay. Thanks for asking. How are you doing? Yes, so it depends on whether or not you're the one producing the compost or the food scraps. One thing, though, that you have to pay close attention to is the moisture level when you are feeding your worms compost only. And the reason that you have to pay a close attention to this is because, as I mentioned, if it's just compost that is being fed to the bin, you're going to notice that it is compacting. When the compost gets compacted, it reduces airflow in the bin. And then when you had too much moisture to that compost, the moisture seals in the air pockets, and so even less airflow is going to be in the bin, and that can be harmful to your worms. So if you're feeding your worms compost only, you have to monitor the amount of water that you have in the bin. And then you don't want the bin to become stagnant if you have too much water in the bin. And another thing is, if you have too much moisture with just compost, you're going to notice that your bin becomes very soggy, and that is something that you don't want either. At the same time, the compost tend to dry out fast, so you have to maintain the bin regularly, monitoring the moisture level, because compost don't produce its own moisture, unlike is the case with food scraps. Let's see. Peggy says, fine, thanks. Hot and humid here in Windermere, Florida. Okay, 90 degrees and 80 humidity. Okay, it's good to know you're doing okay. Yes. So, what have I observed when I'm using outdoor bins? Whether it is my outdoor tiered bin, which is the actual worm bins, or I'm using my compost bins for worm bins. The performance is different from when I'm raising the worms indoors. In my outdoor bin, I noticed that production is a whole lot faster, both in terms of worm reproduction and in terms of how quickly they consume the food scraps that is being fed to them. Right. So the performance is a whole lot faster than all the other type of systems that I've used. And I think that is because when I have them in my compost bin, the compost bin is large, and the quantity of food scraps and bedding that I have in the bin provide a lot of space for them so the worms can move around. And when worms realize that they have a lot of space and food and good airflow and good moisture, then they tend to reproduce faster and they tend to eat more. So I have noticed that my outdoor bins tend to perform a whole lot better than the indoor bins. I've also noticed that for the outdoor bins, which include the actual worm bin and the compost bin that I have worms in, the bins that are compost bins that I have worms in perform better than the actual tiered system that I have outside. So, in terms of worm reproduction and in terms of how fast they produce castings, the compost bin actually performs better. And I think I figure out why it is that over the years the compost bin has been doing better than my tiered system, because the compost bins are resting directly on the ground and they have more space in them. They have more moisture in them. They tend to retain the moisture better than my tiered system. The lower one that is on the ground tend to retain more moisture than the upper layer, because the upper tier has the flow through system, so more airflow from both the bottom and from the top, so it tends to dry out the bin a lot. So I've noticed it for that reason that bin does not tend to perform as much or as good as the others. So what I started doing this year, and I have noticed a drastic difference since I started doing that, is for that tiered system, that upper layer that has more airflow and tend to dry out more. I have been watering it more frequently than the previous years, and since I started doing that this year, I've noticed that the production has increased drastically. So now I found what the problem was, so I have that under control. So it is very important, if your bin is elevated and if it has a lot of exposure to airflow, that you monitor the moisture level in the bin. So that's another thing that I've learned. Okay, so indoors compared to the outdoor bins, I've noticed that the outdoor bin outperform the indoor bins. I don't know if it is because of the availability of space in the outdoor bins, or if it is because I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, the bins that are outdoors tend to perform better than the ones indoors. The one indoors, they are smaller, which means that is less space for the worms to move around. But then if you use a ratio of worms to the bedding and the food scraps compared to the outdoor bin, then the performance should be the same. So I don't know if it is because the temperature tends to be more consistent with the ones outdoors. I don't know what it is. I still haven't figured that out yet, but hopefully I will be able to figure out why the ones outdoors tend to be performing better than those indoors. Of course, naturally for the ones indoors, I've noticed that over the summer or the warmer periods, they tend to perform better than in the cooler periods. And part of it is my fault because the garage is not fully protected from the cold. It is a heated garage, but then the door that we bought the property with need to be changed out into a more modern door that is insulated, and then the gaps around the door need to be sealed. So that could be my fault. But yes, the bin does perform better. The indoor bins perform better in the summer than in the winter. Hi, Russell. Yes, that's what I'm thinking too, that the bins outdoor are getting more oxygen. And in fact, my door to my garage, I tend to keep it closed most of the time. In the winter, it's always closed. And in the summer, if I'm working outside, then I keep the door open. But then as soon as I'm finished working, I close the door. So that constant airflow is not there. So that could be part of the reason. Let's see. Hi, Brooklyn Giraffe. The worms in your outdoor bins are longer and chubbier than the ones indoor. Okay. I always found that to be peculiar since I feed them the same scraps. Yes. Okay, so it's good to know that someone else is having the same experience. So I guess that means that it's not just me and it's not that I'm doing something wrong, I guess. So that's good to know. Thanks for sharing that, Brooklyn Giraffe. Yes, so it could be, as Russell said, the oxygen makes a lot of difference. So another thing that I have noticed though, if you are feeding your worms food scraps, then a lot more maintenance is required. Um, because one, you have to be feeding the worms regularly because depending on the type of worm bin that you have, you may not be able to fill the bin with food scraps because you don't want, and depending on how many worms are in that bin anyway, you don't want to have so much food scraps that the worms cannot consume it within a reasonable amount of time. So it results in you having to feed the bin regularly. If you have a lot of worms in your bin, then fine, you can fill the bin with food scraps. But other than that, you have to be monitoring how much you feed the worms because one, you don't want the bin to become moldy, you don't want it to go anaerobic, you don't want it to get smelly. So when you have a lot of food scraps, and especially if you are from a family that consume a lot of organic matter or vegetable or garden produce, so you're going to have a lot of food scraps. You have to contemplate what you're going to do with the material that you are not feeding to your worms yet, which means that one, you're either going to have to find ways of storing it, you're going to decide whether or not you're going to freeze and thaw, or you're just going to let it sit and break down on its own. So it does require more effort than if you're feeding just compost to your worms. Then you also have to worry about it attracting pests and what method you have to take to control these pests. Now, one of the advantages of feeding food scraps is that it grows more bacteria faster than finished compost, because the finished compost has already gone through that process where it breeds a lot of bacteria. Of course, it keeps on breathing bacteria, but less as it has been composted already. So the advantage of the food scraps when you feed that to the worm is that it produces more bacteria for the worms to feed on. And we're going to discuss the bacteria that worms feed on a little bit further down in the discussion. Right. So it breeds more bacteria for the worms. It produces its own water, and in most instances, you don't necessarily have to water your bin. And if you water your bin, it's just a small amount of water you would need as compared to when you are using compost. When you use compost as the worm food, you have to water the bin all the time, which means you're going to be using more water. So, those are some of the advantages of using food scraps. And the food scraps, you don't have to spend the time to compost it either. So that is another benefit. Okay, and White says she doesn't add water to her bin. Right, so that's good. Yeah, so one of the advantages of using compost though is that it does not get moldy and it doesn't get smelly. So another thing that I have noticed when I'm using compost in my worm bin is that if I use compost along with things like shredded paper, dried leaves, and cardboard, the bin tend to produce pretty much the same as if I am feeding the worms food scraps, as long as I make sure that I have the right moisture content in the bin. So if I'm using just the compost, then the production is very slow. But then if I use the compost with other beddings like the paper, the dried leaves, and the cardboard, then the bin tend to produce pretty much at the same level as if I'm feeding food scraps. So that is one advantage. Let's see. Leafy says, just fed my worms my sweet bell pepper that I got a little rotten at the bottom. Okay. Yes, and bell pepper produce so much water that you don't necessarily have to water your bin if that's what you're feeding them. Okay, so another thing that I have learned based on my experience in February of this year is that worms, the red wigglers and the European night crawlers, as we know, they are able to tolerate a certain level of cold and a certain level of heat. But what I have learned this February is that they can survive being frozen for a short period of time. You don't want to be they don't want you don't want to have them frozen for any extended period of time because naturally they're going to die, but they can survive being frozen for a very short period of time. I don't know if that is the case with African night crawlers and with blue worms, because blue worms and African night crawlers, they tend to like heat more than they do the cold. So chances are if they get frozen, they may die. They will definitely die faster than the red wigglers and the European night crawlers if they get frozen. Now, there's one thing that has been puzzling me for a while though, because in my research it's constantly saying, oh, hi, Melanie. Yeah, it's constantly said that worms feed on the bacteria that is produced on the food scraps. The thing that puzzled me about that is that really so? And the reason I'm puzzled is if I have two containers, same size, with food scraps in there. One has worms and the other doesn't. The worms are feeding on the bacteria. The compost is going to produce bacteria. The food scraps or the material that is being composted is going to be producing bacteria. The material that is being fed to the worms is going to be producing bacteria. And if you have the same amount of food scraps in both containers, they are going to be producing the same amount of bacteria. If you have those two bins at the same time and you had worms to one, the one that you had the worm to will break down a whole lot faster than the one that does not have the worms. Now, if the worms are eating the bacteria only, it means that there is going to be less bacteria in the bin to break down the food scraps than there is bacteria to break down the food scraps in the bin that does not have worms. So then, why is it that the food scraps break down faster in the bin that has the worms than the bin that does not have worms? Shouldn't the bin without worms that has all the bacteria not being eaten break down faster? So then that leads me to conclude that the worms are eating not just the bacteria, but they must be eating the food scraps as well. Because otherwise, the one without worms should be breaking down. What do you think? Yeah, so another thing that I have learned is that worms do not leave your bins if the condition in the bins are okay. That is good because not only do you get to keep your worms, but once you see your worms starting to try to escape the bin, right away you have an indication that something is not right in the bin. So the fact that the worms are leaving, right away you know something is wrong. You can go ahead and diagnose or try to figure out what the problem is, why they're trying to leave, and then you can correct that matter. So it is pretty good that they don't leave the bin, because when they do, then you can know right away that something is wrong. Let's see. Leafy Wiggy says the worm enzymes help in the breakdown. That is true. That is true. But then for the worm enzyme to help break it down, it means that the food scraps has to be inside their bodies. So they would be eating the food scrap to help break it down, right? Yes, and I don't know if maybe the worm droppings help to break down the food because of the microbes that it produces. I don't know, but if you start the bin today and you both bins have the same amount of food, say you had fresh food, the food hasn't started breaking down yet, so there wouldn't be enough bacteria for the worms to feed on at that point in time. When you go back the following day to check on the bin, the amount of food scraps that you put in will not be the amount of food scraps that you see in the bin. So even that is an indication that they must be eating the food scraps as well. Let's see. Russell says, if I had $1 every time I have seen red wigglers in frozen ice and then thaw, come out in hibernation, come out of hibernation, I would have a few dollars. I have also seen them unthaw to mush. Oh, okay. Yes, I have noticed that too, because in 2019 when I was collecting food scraps from a restaurant, and I had quite a bit of piles of food scraps. The piles were about 6 feet wide in diameter, and they were about 4 feet or so high. And the pile was frozen from top to bottom. And right after the bin thaw out, like immediately after, not the bin, but the pile of food scraps, immediately after it thaw out, there were adult, mature red wrigglers in that material moving around. And if they had died, then the eggs could not have hatched and produced mature adult worms within that short period of time, because the moment the material thaw, there is adults in there. So they can survive some amount of freezing. Some of them are going to die off, some of them won't, but it seems as if they are able to survive some amount of freezing. They produce enzymes on their skin as well. Okay, interesting. I didn't know that. Let's see. Peggy says, I've always noticed that they eat the food. If you ever if you have ever given them frozen melon rind slices, they're all over the rinds. There is no bacteria growing on them after a few hours. Okay, yes, I do agree. It would appear as if they do eat not just the food scraps, but sorry, not just the bacteria, but the food scraps as well. So another thing that I have learned regarding worm farming is in relation to the castings, because when I first started vermicomposting, as I mentioned before, my goal was just to produce compost faster. So that is the reason why I got into it. But then as the years go by, I started to learn more and more about worm farming and more about the benefits of worm farming. And it's quite interesting to learn that one, they can be used for pest control, they can be used to control some amount of pathogens, and they produce microbes, or the castings produce microbes, and microbes are so beneficial for the plants. And then learning that not only does the worms break down the food scraps faster, but they also, the food scraps that they eat after they produce the casting have far more nutrients than the regular finished compost. So these are some of the things that I have learned since I start composting with worms 5 years ago. Hopefully I will continue to learn a lot. I'd like to learn all there is about them. So I'm going to continue doing a lot of experiments with the worms, because I don't think I can ever know too much about them. And one of the benefits of learning about worms, it is not that you have to know everything there is to know about worms and vermicomposting in order to be a successful worm farmers. Pretty much there are many, many worm farmers who have been doing it for quite a while, and they pretty much know that you feed the worms give you castings, you have to maintain a certain temperature for the worms, and certain moisture level for the worms and stuff like that, but they don't dig deep into learning more about worm farming. But yet still they're very successful worm farmers. So it's not that you have to learn all there is to know about worms, but I enjoy learning about them, because I believe that the more you know about them, when you're faced with issues, the better able you're gonna be to solve problems. And then for new worm farmers who have a lot of questions, you are able to help out such ones. And then there are so many people who know so much about worms. So when you talk to them, you are gaining knowledge from them as well. So I'd like to continue learning all that I can about them. Plus, it is fun. I find it quite relaxing to raise these guys and take care of them. I quite find it quite enjoyable. So, what have you guys learned in your years or weeks or months of worm farming? Yeah, so there are some do's and don'ts that I have learned. And so some of the don'ts that I have learned is not to allow my worm bin to go dry for too long. It's interesting though that if your bin is left for a period of time and starts to dry out, even when the material is so dry that it is crumbly, you will find worms living in it. It is quite interesting because the amount of moisture that the worms need to breathe is definitely not there in the bin, but yet still you find them. You will find quite a few worms living in a bin that has dried out to a great extent. But doing that is actually dangerous for the worms. Not so my goal is to not allow my bins to dry out because it tends to happen quite often if I get too busy. And I think that is one of the things that have been affecting my production because when I get overly busy, sometimes I say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to look after them, but then tomorrow comes and I'm still busy. And so it gets pushed back. And even if it doesn't get pushed back for a very long period of time, it is enough to affect the worms. So, and even though I have a schedule and I try to stick to my schedule, it's not always easy to stick to a schedule. But then there are some things in life that you should not put off. When it comes to life on a whole, you should not put off things that you can do. Sacrifice things that does not involve life. But if it involves life, then it's not worth sacrificing. And sometimes we might say, oh, it's just worms, but it is still a life. So whatever we can do to preserve it. So I'm going to make it a goal to ensure that the days that are scheduled for my worms that I actually spend the time to look after them. And sometimes because I don't have the time to look after the worms the way I used to, because I have two worm shelves, and on one day of the week I look after one worm shelf, and another day of the week I look after the other shelves. So what I have been doing, if I don't have the time to look after the shelf, then none of the worms get looked after. So one of the things that steps that I'm putting in place now is to ensure that if I don't have time to go through the entire shelf for the day, even if it is half an hour to look after a few of the bins, I'm going to spend the half an hour, because if every day I spend half an hour, I will catch up eventually to where I need to be. So these are some of the steps that I'm going to be taking. I keep putting things off a lot, and then when it is time to get it done, sometimes I don't. So I'm going to have to work on that seriously. This year is going to be a bit of a challenge with my goals regarding my worms because, as you know, with the condition of my door for the garage, the worms are not going to be doing well over the winter if I don't get that door fixed. And then with the rodents occasionally going in the garage when it is freezing cold, I have to get those mesh on. But then I was supposed to be working on that gradually. Now I can't work on it at all. So I think I'm going to be in a bit of a trouble this year because at the end of August it's going to start getting cold. The worms are okay in September with the temperature being cold, but after September they're going to be in trouble if I don't get the door fixed. But with my hand, I am not going to be able to do anything with this for at least another month. Could be longer. Hopefully, it doesn't go beyond a month. So I'm stuck not being able to do any of those projects that I had lined up for this month into next month. But I guess that's life. We just have to make the most of it. Let's see. Oh, the screen is so small. Okay, you have learned, Hanwhite, that it doesn't take much to grow your worm bin. That is true, and more so for people who are living in areas where they don't have freezing temperature, or if you have freezing temperature is only for a short period of time, or if you are able to keep your bin indoors, then your production is going to be even better than people who are in frigidly cold areas and can't keep their worms where the temperature can be kept consistent. Oh, hi, best yet, Journey. How are you? Oh, Peggy says red wigglers make great pets. I agree. I agree. I don't want a dog and I don't want a cat, not because I don't like them. I love having them around, but in my region, I don't think I would raise a dog. I don't think I would raise a cat because one, I don't clean dog poop. Um, Growing up in Jamaica, they would tell you dog poop blind your eyes. It affects your eyes because there is some chemical that is released from it, and over a period of time, it doesn't happen suddenly, but over a period of time, it does damage your eyes. So for that reason, I don't want to be walking around cleaning dog poop, and I don't want to be out in freezing temperature walking the dog. Legally, you are required to walk your dogs in this region, even if it is cold. So I don't want to be outside when it is cold. So for that reason, I'm not going to have a dog, and I don't believe a dog should be in my house either. No offense to those who are okay with dogs in their house, but I don't want a dog in my house. And then in this country, dogs tend to shed a lot. And I don't want to be going out and have dog fur all over me. Cats, same thing. I don't want the shedding. So although I love those creatures, if I'm in a warm country, then I'll raise them because they can be outside. The cats are allowed to come in, but they can't be in the house all the time. They come and go as they please. So, yes, so those pets I won't have. And then the worst part of it is not the cleaning of the poop or walking them in the winter, but the worst part of it is the medical bill for pets in this country is higher than the medical bill for humans. So there's no way I'm going to be paying those expensive bills. So for that reason I can't have pets, but I love my worms. They're not needy, they don't come around you constantly wanting wanting attention and all of that, telling you to walk them when you don't have the time to walk them. Yeah, so so for that reason I don't have dogs, but I do like having my worms around. They are my pets. Someone is trying to reach me. I'm gonna have to take the call later. Okay, so let's see. Rosa says I am starting an experiment with popcorn. Interesting. As a microgreen. Hmm, interesting. Doing a germination test in the main bin. Going to experiment in cocoon buckets. Goal is baby yellow or white sweet microgreens. Nice. Let us know how that turned out. Yeah, I've never tried. I've heard of people using corns, not popcorn, but corns as a microgreen. I don't know. I attempted to grow microgreens last year several times. They were all a failure. And this year I've been so busy I didn't even get the chance to try it again. I wanted to, but I guess I'm gonna leave that until next year to see. But yes, do let us know how that turned out. Okay, so Peggy says, you have a wonderful life attitude. Oh, thank you. Okay, best yet, you're doing well. That's good. Yes, and White, I know you love your cats. Yes, but it's too expensive to take care of them here. And I didn't even know that cats can have, well, Cats, dogs, all of them can have so many illnesses. All the illnesses that mankind can have, these animals seem to have them too. I was very surprised to learn that when I came here, because in Jamaica, if you have a cat and the cat is sick, sometimes you will know it is sick and you take it to the vet. Other times you won't know the cat is sick. You will just notice that it is behaving a little differently. But then both the cats and the dog, what they do if they're sick is that they leave home and you never see them again. So they won't die for you to see them. They will go somewhere where you can't find them and die. But it was rather surprising to learn that they can have cancer, they can have arthritis, they can have diabetes. Yes. And I don't know if I have to deal with them in this country when they get sick to a certain point, you have to put them down. I don't know if I could deal with that. So uh, that's that's gonna be too much to handle. So I'd rather the way they do it in Jamaica, where the dogs or the cat just leave home and die, because at least then I don't have to see them suffering. I know there are those who will prefer to actually have them with them while they're going through that, but that's a little bit more heartrending than I can handle. Hi, Michael. It's been a while. How are you doing? Oh, you have been feeding dandelion greens to your bin. I do freeze them to kill root bits. Okay, that's interesting. So, what do you do with the seeds? Or do you feed it to them before they actually start producing seeds? Because I know if you put the seeds, even if you freeze the seeds, they can still germinate. So, what do you do with the seeds, Michael? My bin, love dandelion greens. Okay, nice. And why it says it is expensive to care for here as well. Okay. Okay, you're doing okay. That's good. Yes. I've never tried feeding my worms dandelion. I have so many dandelions outside though. What I've been doing with the dandelion is I root it out and I put it in a black plastic bag, because the bag is going to heat up and kill the seeds. And then I have been putting that into my compost bin, but I've never really tried feeding it to my worm bin. I'm gonna test it. I'm gonna create a bin and feed it just the dandelions and see how that works. But then I'm gonna have to put it through the black plastic to kill off the seeds before I do that. Okay, you take off the seed heads or harvest them before they seed. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so I'm gonna try that. Oh, maybe I should jot that down so that I can experiment in one of my little bins to see if my worms will actually like it. Because dandelions are dimes a dozen here. Let's see. Russell says dandelion greens and wild lettuce do wonderful in worm bin. Oh, hmm. Those I have lots of, lots and lots. So I'm gonna try that in the worm bin. I have been doing my best to avoid putting the weeds that I harvest or that I dig up into my worm bin, because I noticed that some things tend to take longer to break down in the worm bin. But I guess those things tend to have a soft leaf. They're leafy. They don't really have a lot of stalk. So they should break down. The worm should be able to consume those readily. Oh, Michael says, and no bug issues. Also, lots of nutrients in dandelion. Okay, so that's good. That's one benefit. No bug issues. Okay, so they break down faster than the store-bought lettuces. I guess maybe because all of those chemicals that they use on their store produce, all those chemicals that they use both in the stores to preserve it a little longer and the chemicals that they use when they're growing the plants is going to have some effect on those store-bought food scraps. But yes, that's interesting. I'm definitely going to be trying it. I rooted up some of those dandelions and those wild lettuce yesterday, but I already put those in the green bag. So I'm gonna, oh, maybe I could do that later on. Oh, no, maybe tomorrow. Yeah, so I'm going to root out some and try it and see how it works. Because that would be additional source of food for my worms, especially now since I'm no longer collecting food scraps from the restaurant. All of that came to an end after the pandemic started. I wonder if I should start going back there to collect. Let's see. Russell says, oh, Michael says, Russell, if you freeze lettuce first, the breakdown easier. Yes, but that is one of the things. I don't really want to be freezing things before I feed it to the worms. That burns a little extra current. So what I have been doing is when I have food scraps, sometimes I do freeze depending on the type of food scraps that it is. So if I have green banana peel or green plantain peel, or if I have yam peel, and when I say yam, I'm not talking about sweet potatoes. I'm talking about the actual yam. If I have these type of peels that tend to dry out faster than they break down, then I will dice them up and just throw them in the freezer for a day or two and take them back out. But I don't really like freezing the food because it takes up space in the freezer and it will send up the bill depending on how much of it you have. So what I've been doing is cutting up these things and putting them out in the compost bin, allow them to break down before giving them to start breaking down before giving them to the worms. But then in the winter I do make use of the outdoors. So I just cut up the food scraps and just tie them in a plastic bag, put them in a bucket and put them outdoors, let them stay there and freeze. And then a day or two before I'm ready for them, I'll just bring them indoors. That tend to work quite nicely because we have at least 7 months of freezing temperatures, 7 to 9 months of freezing temperature. So using that method works pretty well. See, Russell says one nice thing about dandelion and wild lettuce greens, they do not dump moisture. It is reliable that way. Okay, that's good to know. Other weeds I put on top of the outdoor bins until dry and then cover with carbon. Okay, okay, that's some good information. I'm a bit concerned for this year though. I don't know what I'm going to do because usually at the end of August or before August end, I start harvesting my worms from my bins outdoors. I'm not sure what I'm going to do this year because in August I won't be able to do any of that. And it's going to be cold, too cold for the worms to be outside in September. So I don't know what I'm going to do about that just yet. I'm thinking that I might have to convert some of my 55-gallon water drums into temporary holding bins and just take up the material, worms, castings, and everything from the worm bin and put them in that and store them inside my garage until I'm able to separate the worms from the castings and restart the bin. I don't know. But even that is going to be a challenge. But uh, life, I guess. Michael says, I have a chest, large chest freezer. It actually costs less than when it's full, than half empty. Okay, okay, that's good to know. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Well, all my freezers are full. There's barely any space to put anything in them, so freezing is not really much of an option for me. Freezing the food scraps, that is. I disabled. I'm disabled, so can't turn conventional compost. So worms are my composters. Okay. Yes, at least you have the worms there to help you along with that. Yeah. I kind of feel your pain now that I've injured my hand because there's so much that I need to get done. I can't put the mesh on my worm shelves. I can't do anything to the garage door. Pretty much the only thing I can do at the moment is, thankfully, the way I set up my worm bin, I can use just the one hand to pull out the bin and wet just half of the bin because I can't take the bin out to wet or maintain the full bin, so I can only wet half of the bin. For the bins that are low, I can pull them out further and wet down the entire bin, but for the bins on the upper shelf, I can only wet like half of it, so I can't even turn the compost that is in there, so it's a bit tricky. It's very tricky, but though at least I can maintain them to an extent, but I'm very concerned about harvesting those worms that are in the outdoor bin. So that's the advantage. The advantage is that the worms that are in the outdoor bins, the only thing I need to do is go there and wet the bin. I don't have to be handling the bin. But the disadvantage is I need to start harvesting the castings and separating the worms early next month, and I won't be able to do that. But I guess I'll find a way. Unfortunately, I don't have anyone that I can ask to assist me with that either. My big daughter is no longer living with us, so I could have asked for her help, but I guess. Oh, thank you, Michael. Thank you. Yeah, that's it's gonna take a while because it's a serious injury, so it's gonna take quite a while. It is recovering quite fast, really, but from what I'm hearing, it can be anything from 2 months to 2 years before it is fully recovered. But I think at least I will be able to use it within a few months if it continue the way it is now, or continue improving the way it is improving now. Yes, but the good thing is I'm still getting my videos out. I'm still able to share practical information. I'm still able to take care of my worms. So although everything takes a whole lot longer, I'm still getting things done. So I am thankful. It could have been worse. Okay, so that is all that I have prepared for discussing for this live. And I think if there are no other comments, I'm going to be saying goodbye to you guys until today's Friday, Monday, until Monday. Hope you guys stay safe, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend and happy gardening. Okay, take care, Michael. And everyone else, have a lovely weekend.